You guys have been absolutely flooding my comments asking for motel horror stories for months now. I kept putting it off because finding genuinely terrifying true stories that actually happened in motels is harder than you might think. But after digging through hundreds of submissions and doing my research, I finally found 3 stories that will make you think twice before checking into any roadside motel ever again. Picture this. You're driving cross-country, it's getting late, you're exhausted, and you see that flickering neon sign advertising cheap rooms for the night. Seems harmless enough, right? Well, the people in tonight's stories thought the exact same thing. What they discovered behind those motel room doors changed their lives forever. I'm talking about encounters so disturbing that one person still can't sleep in hotel rooms without checking every single hiding spot first. Another story involves a discovery so horrifying that the police had to shut down the entire establishment. And the third story, let's just say it proves that sometimes the most dangerous thing about a motel isn't what you might find in your room, but who might already be watching you from the shadows. Now, before we dive into these nightmare-fuel stories, I have to warn you that these accounts are absolutely real. These aren't urban legends or creepypasta stories found on Reddit. These are genuine experiences submitted by real people who lived through these terrifying encounters. Some details have been changed to protect identities, but the core events happened exactly as described. Also, if you're planning any road trips in the near future, you might want to bookmark this video for after your travels. Trust me on this one. And if you end up enjoying these spine-chilling tales, make sure you hit that subscribe button because I've got a whole collection of true horror stories that will keep you up at night. Alright, let's get into it. Our first story comes from a traveling salesman named Marcus who was driving through rural Nevada back in 2019. It was one of those scorching hot summer days where the asphalt shimmers like water, and your car feels like an oven even with the air conditioning blasting. Marcus had been on the road for nearly 12 hours straight, driving from Sacramento to Denver for a business conference. His eyes were burning, his back ached, and he knew he needed to find a place to crash for the night before he became a danger to himself and other drivers. The problem was, he'd taken a detour off the main highway to avoid construction traffic. And now he found himself on some forgotten stretch of desert road with nothing but sagebrush and telephone poles for miles. Just when he was starting to panic about having to sleep in his car, he spotted it in the distance. A small cluster of buildings with a faded sign that read, Desert Palms Motel. As he pulled into the gravel parking lot, Marcus noticed the place had definitely seen better days. The paint was peeling, half the letters in the neon sign were burnt out, and there were only 2 other cars in the entire lot despite it being a Friday night. But at that point, he was so exhausted he would have slept on a park bench. All he needed was a bed and a shower. The front office was dimly lit and smelled like stale cigarettes and industrial cleaner. Behind the counter sat an elderly man with thick glasses and liver spots covering his hands. The man looked up from his newspaper and gave Marcus a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Marcus paid for one night in cash and was handed an actual metal key attached to a plastic diamond-shaped keychain. Room 7, The old man pointed toward the far end of the building and mumbled something about the ice machine being broken before returning to his newspaper. Room 7 was exactly what you'd expect from a budget motel in the middle of nowhere. Faded carpet with mysterious stains, a bed that sagged in the middle, and a television that probably hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration. But it had air conditioning that worked and a bathroom with running water, so Marcus wasn't complaining. He took a quick shower, ordered a pizza that took over an hour to arrive, and settled in to watch some mindless late-night television before getting some much-needed sleep. Around midnight, he finally turned off the TV and the lights. The room was completely dark except for the thin strips of light sneaking in around the heavy curtains from the parking lot security lights outside. That's when he heard it for the first time. A faint scratching sound coming from somewhere inside the walls. At first, Marcus thought it might be mice or some other desert rodent that had found its way into the building. Old motels in the middle of nowhere probably dealt with that kind of thing all the time. But as he lay there listening, the scratching seemed to follow a pattern. 3 quick scratches, a pause, then 3 more scratches. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic to be a random animal. The sound seemed to be moving along the wall behind the headboard of his bed, traveling from one side of the room to the other. Marcus sat up and turned on the bedside lamp. The scratching immediately stopped. He waited in silence for several minutes but heard nothing else. Figuring his exhausted mind was playing tricks on him, he turned the light back off and tried to go back to sleep. But the moment the room went dark again, the scratching returned. This time it sounded like it was coming from directly behind his head. 3 scratches, pause, 3 scratches, pause. Over and over again with mechanical precision. Sleep was clearly not going to happen with that noise. So Marcus decided to investigate. He turned the lights back on and examined the wall behind the bed. It was just standard motel room paneling with a few small nail holes where previous guests had probably hung pictures. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. He pressed his ear against the wall and listened carefully. Silence, but the moment he pulled his head away, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. One of the nail holes was slightly larger than the others, and when he looked closer, he realized it wasn't a nail hole at all. It was perfectly round, about the size of a pencil, and it went completely through the wall. Marcus felt his heart start racing as he grabbed his phone and turned on the flashlight app. He shined the light directly into the hole, and what he saw on the other side made him stumble backward so quickly he nearly fell over the bed. There was an eye looking back at him. A human eye, bloodshot and wide with surprise at being discovered, staring directly into his room through that tiny opening in the wall. For just a split second, Marcus and the person on the other side of the wall made direct eye contact before the eye quickly disappeared. Marcus grabbed his keys and his wallet and ran for the door without even bothering to pack his belongings. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely get the key into the lock. As he fumbled with the door, he heard the scratching sound again. But now it was coming from multiple locations along the wall. Scratch, scratch, scratch from behind the bed. Scratch, scratch, scratch from near the bathroom. Scratch, scratch, scratch from the wall by the window. Someone or multiple someones had been watching him through peepholes drilled throughout the room. He finally got the door open and sprinted to his car, not even looking back as he peeled out of the parking lot in a cloud of dust and gravel. He drove for another 3 hours until he reached a well-lit truck stop where he spent the rest of the night in his car, doors locked, checking and rechecking his surroundings every few minutes. The next morning, Marcus called the police from Denver and reported what he'd experienced. The officer who took his statement said they'd had similar complaints about that particular motel before. But by the time they investigated, the place was always empty and there was never any evidence of wrongdoing. Marcus never found out who was watching him that night or what their intentions were. But he did learn something that still haunts him to this day. When he searched online for information about the Desert Palms Motel, he discovered that it had been the subject of multiple missing persons reports over the years. Travelers who had checked in but never checked out. People whose cars were found abandoned in the parking lot with no trace of the drivers. The motel was eventually shut down by local authorities, but not until several months after Marcus's terrifying encounter. He often wonders what might have happened if he hadn't noticed that hole in the wall, or if he'd decided to ignore the scratching sounds and just try to sleep through them. Our second story takes place in a small town in Oregon and comes from a woman named Sarah who was traveling with her teenage daughter back in 2020. They were driving from Portland to visit Sarah's mother in California when their car broke down just outside a town so small it didn't even have a McDonald's. The local mechanic told them it would take at least 2 days to get the part they needed. So Sarah found herself stuck in this tiny logging community with very limited accommodation options. There was exactly one motel in town, a place called the Pine Ridge Inn that looked like it had been frozen in time since the 1970s. The woman running the front desk was friendly enough, though she seemed nervous about something. She kept glancing toward the stairs that led to the second floor and mentioned multiple times that they only had first-floor rooms available. When Sarah asked about the second floor, the woman quickly changed the subject and handed over the key to room 12. Their room was clean but dated, with wood paneling on the walls and orange shag carpeting that had definitely seen better decades. Sarah's daughter Emma immediately complained about the weird smell in the room. Something musty and sweet that seemed to be coming from the heating vents, but they were exhausted from dealing with the car situation all day. So they decided to just power through it. That first night passed without incident, though Emma kept saying she felt like someone was watching them through the window. Sarah chalked it up to teenage anxiety about being stuck in an unfamiliar place. The next morning at breakfast, they met another stranded traveler, an older gentleman whose RV had broken down just outside town. He'd been staying at the Pine Ridge Inn for almost a week and seemed eager to talk to someone new. During their conversation, he mentioned something strange he'd noticed about the motel. Every night around 2 a.m., he could hear footsteps coming from the second floor, pacing back and forth above his room. But when he'd asked the front desk about other guests, he was told the second floor had been closed for renovations for months. Sarah didn't think much of it until that second night when she was awakened by the exact same sound. footsteps moving slowly across the ceiling above their room from one end to the other, then back again. The pattern continued for nearly an hour before finally stopping. In the morning, Sarah decided to investigate. She waited until the front desk woman stepped away, then quietly climbed the stairs to the second floor. The hallway was dusty and dark, with several doors standing slightly ajar. As she walked down the corridor, checking each room, she noticed that most of them were completely empty except for old furniture covered in sheets. But when she reached the room directly above where she and Emma had been sleeping, she found something that made her stomach drop. The door was locked, but through the gap underneath, she could see that someone had been living in there. There were food containers, empty water bottles, and what looked like a sleeping bag spread out on the floor. More disturbing were the dozens of photographs scattered around the makeshift living space. Photos that had clearly been taken through windows at night, showing people sleeping in their motel rooms. Sarah recognized some of the rooms from the first floor, including what looked like shots of her and Emma from the night before. She backed away from the door as quietly as possible and hurried downstairs, her mind racing. Someone had been secretly living on the second floor of the motel, watching guests through their windows and photographing them while they slept. The front desk woman either didn't know about it or was actively covering it up. Sarah immediately woke Emma and started packing their belongings. When her daughter asked what was wrong, Sarah just said they needed to leave right away. As they were loading their suitcases into the mechanic's loaner car, Sarah noticed someone watching them from a second-floor window. A figure in dark clothing, partially hidden behind the curtains, tracking their every movement. They drove straight to the police station and reported what Sarah had discovered. The officers seemed familiar with complaints about the Pine Ridge Inn and told her they'd been trying to investigate the place for months but never had enough evidence to get a warrant. Sarah's testimony was apparently the break they needed. That same afternoon, police raided the motel and found exactly what she described. Someone had been living illegally on the second floor for an unknown amount of time, surviving on food stolen from the motel's vending machines and water from the bathroom sinks. They drilled tiny holes in the floor to spy on guests in the rooms below and had collected hundreds of photographs of unsuspecting travelers. The person they arrested was a drifter with a history of stalking and voyeurism, who had somehow convinced the motel owner to let him stay in exchange for doing maintenance work around the property. The owner claimed she had no idea what he was really doing up there, but police found evidence suggesting she'd been aware of his activities for quite some time. Sarah learned later that several women had reported feeling watched or having their belongings moved around during stays at the Pine Ridge Inn, but most hadn't reported it to police, assuming they were just being paranoid. The motel was shut down pending a full investigation, and the owner faced multiple charges related to enabling the voyeurism. But our final story might be the most disturbing of all, and it comes from a couple named Jake and Michelle who experienced something so terrifying during a road trip through rural Texas that they still can't talk about it without getting visibly shaken. They were driving from Houston to Phoenix in the summer of 2021 when they decided to stop for the night in a small desert town about an hour outside of El Paso. The only accommodation available was a run-down motor lodge called the Cactus Court that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. The elderly couple running the place seemed normal enough, though they insisted on walking Jake and Michelle to their room personally instead of just giving them directions. Room 15 was at the very end of the building, isolated from the other occupied rooms by several empty units on either side. Everything seemed fine at first. The room was basic but clean, the air conditioning worked, and they were both exhausted from driving all day. They ordered food from a nearby diner, watched some television, and went to bed around 11 p.m. without any concerns. Jake woke up around 3 a.m. needing to use the bathroom. As he was walking back to bed, he glanced out the window and noticed something odd in the parking lot. There was a van parked directly outside their room that hadn't been there when they'd gone to sleep. But what really caught his attention was that someone was sitting in the driver's seat just watching their room. He woke Michelle and quietly pointed out the window. The van was still there, and the figure inside appeared to be holding something up to their face, possibly binoculars or a camera with a long lens. They watched for several minutes, trying to decide what to do, when suddenly the van's engine started and it slowly drove away. Jake wanted to call the police, but Michelle convinced him it might have been nothing. Maybe just someone making a phone call or checking directions on their GPS. They decided to try to go back to sleep, but both of them felt uneasy about the situation. Around 5 a.m., Jake woke up again, this time to the sound of their room door opening. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, he could see a dark figure standing in the doorway. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Jake reached for the bedside lamp and flicked it on. The figure immediately ran, slamming the door behind them. Jake jumped up and checked the lock, which was still engaged from the inside. But when he examined the door more closely, he realized someone had used some kind of tool to manipulate the lock mechanism from the outside. Probably a technique learned from years of breaking into motel rooms. They called 911 immediately and barricaded the door with the dresser while they waited for police to arrive. When the officers showed up 20 minutes later, they found clear evidence that someone had tampered with the lock. There were fresh scratches around the mechanism and what looked like metal shavings on the ground outside their door. But the most disturbing discovery came when police searched the area around their room. Hidden in the bushes directly outside their window, they found a small digital camera that had been recording their room all night. The memory card contained hours of footage of Jake and Michelle sleeping, along with similar recordings from several other motel rooms. The camera belonged to the elderly man who ran the motel with his wife. Police arrested him on multiple charges, including breaking and entering, voyeurism, and invasion of privacy. During questioning, he admitted to secretly recording guests for years, selling the footage to online networks that specialized in that type of illegal content. His wife claimed she had no knowledge of his activities, but investigators found evidence suggesting she'd been helping him identify which rooms had attractive young couples or women traveling alone. They would give those guests the isolated rooms at the end of the building where he could set up his cameras and access the rooms more easily. Jake and Michelle learned that they weren't the first guests to report strange incidents at the Cactus Court. Several other travelers had complained about feeling watched, finding their belongings moved, or discovering evidence that someone had been in their rooms while they were out. But most people had just assumed they were being paranoid or had forgotten where they'd placed things. The motel was immediately shut down, and both owners were eventually convicted on multiple felony charges. During the investigation, police discovered that this operation had been going on for over a decade, with hundreds of guests unknowingly becoming victims of this disturbing voyeurism ring. So there you have it. 3 absolutely terrifying true stories that will make you think twice before staying at any sketchy roadside motel. These aren't isolated incidents either. Law enforcement agencies across the country have reported similar cases of motel owners and employees secretly recording guests, drilling peepholes between rooms, or allowing unauthorized people to access guest accommodations. The lesson here isn't to never stay in motels, but to always trust your instincts when something feels off. Check your room thoroughly when you arrive, including looking for small holes in walls or unusual objects that might be cameras. Make sure your door locks properly from the inside and consider bringing a door wedge or portable lock for extra security. If you enjoyed these spine-chilling stories and want to hear more true horror experiences, make sure you subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. I've got dozens more terrifying tales that will keep you on the edge of your seat. And if you've ever had a scary experience at a motel or hotel yourself, share it in the comments below. You never know, your story might end up in a future video. Until next time, stay safe out there, and maybe invest in a good quality tent for your next road trip. At least when you're camping, you know exactly who might be watching you from the woods. Sweet dreams, everyone.